Hi everybody, this is Marlene. I want to let you know that I edited parts of the audio to exclude when I went out there to the Valley Jet Memorial and a couple of other parts because it really doesn't make sense to somebody who's just listening to the podcast. However, if you'd like to see the show in its entirety, you can go and check us out at YouTube under Miami Ghost Chronicles, and there you will see and hear the entire thing. Thank you so much for listening.
Very important. You can't ghost bust on an empty stomach. So, guess what? We are here at this great barbecue. Catfish and frog legs. Hello. Okay.
Hey, frog legs taste like chicken.
Okay, so what do you think? Frog legs? I think they also have alligator tail, Henry. Should we, shouldn't we? I don't know. That frog legs
alligator tail supposed to taste kind of fishy.
Oh.
And frog legs, hey, in Cuba they eat those things like.
Okay, bottom line, I can do the catfish I've done and so the alligator, but that frog leg part
I've eaten frog legs. If they cook it right, it's really tasty.
Okay,
but you need like 50 to get full.
Okay, so tell me, it tastes like chicken?
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's
right.
white meat, very tasty.
Okay, so anyway, guys, here we are, and we are going to have a bite to eat before we hit the ghost hunting trail, so to speak, at this barbecue place that's been out here for quite a while, out on US 441 right before you go into the Everglades. So we'll see you guys in a bit. Maybe we'll tape something in there. Let's see. All right.
I'll film her eating frog legs.
No.
Hi everybody, this is Marlene with Miami Ghost Chronicles, Stories of the Supernatural. As you can see, we're headed out there to a memorial that's been placed out in the Everglades for an airplane crash that occurred in May of 1996, which was known as the Value Jet Flight 592. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and read you a little bit of backdrop to what occurred, even though it was national news. It did happen over 20 years ago. And then I'm going to show you another clip of what happened when I was out there. Then I'm going to go into a lot of other mysteries and enigmas and ghostly information that's come my way and is generally known about the Everglades. Believe me, there is a lot that's happened there for well over the last 100 years. So let me go ahead and give you a little bit of information as to what was happening out there. The most recent one, well, as far as crashes, that is, that happened with the Value Jet back in 96. Okay, now, as you know, this flight went down about 7 miles northwest out of MIA, or Miami International Airport. And this was a regularly scheduled flight that flew from Miami over to Atlanta. Okay, and the crash occurred about 11 minutes after it took off from Miami, and the result was that there was a fire in the cargo compartment that was caused by improperly stored cargo. Now, this was determined well after the crash and when there was investigation. But at that time, all passengers, it was 110 people on board, were killed. Now, the thing was that ValueJet already had a very poor safety record before the crash, and the accident brought widespread attention to the problems they'd had. As a matter of fact, the airline had been grounded for several months after the accident, and when operations resumed, its reputation was so damaged that it was forced to merge with AirTran Airways, and it had rebranded itself just to stay in business. Okay, and to date, this accident remains the deadliest in the history of Florida. Okay, now a little bit of background on ValueJet. It was founded in 1992, and it was known for its cost-cutting measures. Okay, and all of its planes were purchased used from other airlines, and it was found that they provided very little training to their workers, and contractors were used for the maintenance and for other services. Now, the company very quickly developed a reputation for lax safety measures, and in 1995, the U.S. military refused their bid, ValueJet's bid, to fly military personnel because of concerns they had for the safety, and that the officials at the FAA wanted the airline to be grounded. Now, the aircraft itself that crashed was already 27 years old, and it had been previously owned by Delta Airlines. And it had first flown back in April of 1969. All right. Then it flew for Delta all the way till 1992. It was retired and then sold back to the manufacturer, eventually going to the hands or being sold to ValueJet in 93. Now, this aircraft had already suffered a series of incidents 2 years before the crash, which included aborted takeoffs and emergency landings. In other words, these were very serious incidents. Okay. Now, in the cockpit were two very experienced pilots. One was Captain Kubek and First Officer Hazen. Okay. Now, this flight left the afternoon of May 11th, 1996 from Gate G2 in Miami after a delay of about 1 hour, okay, already due to mechanical problems. At that time, there was 105 passengers, mostly from Florida and Georgia, as well as two pilots, and 3 flight attendants. So that was the total of 110 people that were on board. Now, at about 2:10 p.m., the passengers started to smell smoke. And around that same time, the pilots heard a loud bang in their headphones, and they noticed that the plane was losing its electrical power. Now, the sag in electrical power and the bang were eventually determined to be the result of a fire in the cargo hold exploding. Now, seconds later, a flight attendant entered the cockpit and informed the flight crew of a fire in the passenger cabin. And the passengers shouting "fire, fire, fire" were recorded on the cockpit voice recorder. Okay, and once they opened the cockpit door. Now the flight attendants, their instructions were that the cockpit door should not be opened when there was either smoke or other harmful gases might be present in the cabin. But the intercom was disabled, and there was no other way to inform the pilots of what was happening, so they were forced to do that. The flight data recorder indicated a progressive failure of the DC-9's electrical and flight control systems due to the spreading fire. Now, both of the pilots, Kubek and Hazen, immediately asked air traffic control to return to Miami because of the increasing smoke in the cockpit and the cabin, and they were told to return to the airport. Now, 1 minute after that, Hazen requested the nearest airport, and the other pilot, Kubek, began to turn the plane around in trying to return it into Miami. Now, it disappeared from the radar at approximately 2:13 p.m., and eyewitnesses nearby watched the plane banked abruptly, then rolled on its side and nosedived into the Everglades, just a few miles west of Miami, at a speed in excess of 507 miles. The pilot, Kubek, lost control of the plane less than 10 seconds before impact. And when they examined the debris, it suggested that the fire had burned through the floorboards in the cabin, resulting in structural failure and damage to cables underneath the instrument panels. Now, the NTSB report that was later issued stated the safety board cannot rule out the possibility that the flight crew was incapacitated by smoke or heat in the cockpit during the last 7 seconds of the flight. Interruptions in the cockpit voice recorder occurred on 2 occasions, one as long as 1 minute and 12 seconds, and the aircraft hit the water at approximately 2:13 p.m., about 10 minutes after takeoff. In other words, there was times where there was no recording, undoubtedly caused by the electrical problems and the fires that were going on with the cables and everything in there. Now, later on, 2 witnesses that were fishing in the area testified at the NTSB that they had seen a low-flying airplane in a steep right bank, and then that angle increased, and the nose of the airplane dropped and continued downward. And in other words, that airplane struck the ground in nearly a vertical attitude, which means it would have been very difficult for anybody to survive that crash, which nobody did. Now, they reported seeing, the witnesses said that they didn't see any external damage to the DC-9 or any sign of fire or smoke other than the engine exhaust. And a group of sightseers in a small private plane also witnessed the crash and provided basically the same testimony or the account, and that the flight or the plane seemed to disappear after hitting the swamp, and they could see nothing but scattered small debris and part of an engine near the crash site. Now, the following are some notable passengers that were killed on this flight. Okay, San Diego Chargers running back Rodney Culver and his wife, songwriter musician Walter Hyatt, former Miami Hurricanes football offensive lineman Robert Woodus. The oldest person aboard was an 84-year-old Conway Hilton, who lived in Miami, and the youngest was a 4-year-old Daniel Darber from Atlanta. Now, on a side note, I'm going to insert this. There was another passenger who was killed, who, believe it or not, was a suspect at that time in a murder. And her name was Delmarie Walker, also known as Delmarie Baker. And she was a primary suspect in the murder of Catherine Holmes in College Park, Georgia. Okay, at the time of the crash, she was 38 years old. She was the mother of 2 teenage children and the wife of a disabled Pennsylvania state policeman. And she was employed as a waitress in Atlanta. Now, this is the story of the murder that she was a suspect in. Okay, she was believed to have killed a disabled friend of hers by the name of Catherine Holmes. This was in March of the previous year, the previous year, and that the murder occurred because she was attempting to find money that Catherine Holmes had just received. Okay. Now, what happened was that Catherine Holmes, who was 40 years old, had recently told her friends that she had come into some money in the amount of $1,800, which had been a gift from her mother, or she had received it from her mother. Now, when her body was found, it was riddled with 20 shallow stab wounds. She was bound hand and foot and had a pillowcase over her head. She had bled to death and had choked also on some object, possibly a sock which had been forced into her throat. Her apartment was ransacked in an apparent effort to find the money, which, believe it or not, had already been deposited in the bank. So basically the killer walked away with nothing. Now, there was also suspected that the killer had walked away with patches of hair missing from their head because the clumps of hair were found in the victim's fists. Now, when the police interviewed Delmarie Walker 2 days after Catherine Holmes was murdered, she had patches of hair missing from her scalp, and she was observed to have cuts on her hands and forearms. She initially refused to give blood samples and became very difficult to find, according to the police. And it took about 6 months to get her fingerprints and to get tests completed from hair samples taken from her. Now, her prints matched those found on Holmes' bathroom sink, where the killer had cleaned up, and the hair matched those in the victim's hand. However, by the time the tests were concluded, Value Jet Flight 592 had plunged into the Everglades, and Delmarie Walker had died there. Now, in 1997, Lieutenant Richard Cromie of College Park Police Department in Georgia said that they closed the case, basically stating that they found that Delmarie Walker was the one that had murdered Catherine Holmes. So in other words, she was found guilty or convicted posthumously after she had died. Now, and some people look at that as karma if indeed she was guilty of that crime. Now, recovery of all the passengers and the crew took several weeks, and the fact was that little in the way of intact human remains were found due to the sheer violence of the impact. There was immersion in the swamp waters and, of course, the scavenging wildlife. Of the 110 persons aboard, only 68 were identified. And sometimes those identifications took place from examining jawbones, and at least one individual was identified just from a single tooth. There was a piece of torn flesh was proven to belong to the first officer Hazen, but Captain Kubek's remains were never found. And of course, because of these factors, there was no toxicology test that could be performed on any of the passengers or the crew members, just to find out how much exposure they had to either fumes or smoke or the fire, anything. Now, at the end, the NTSB found responsibility for 3 parties: SaberTech for improperly packaging and storing hazardous materials on the plane, ValueJet for not supervising SaberTech, and the FAA for not mandating smoke detection and fire suppression systems in cargo holds. Now, in June of '96, the ValueJet was grounded by the FAA, but by September 30th, they were allowed to resume flying, but they never recovered from this crash. And as stated before, in '97, they merged with AirTrans. Many of the families of this flight were outraged that ValueJet was never prosecuted, especially considering their poor safety record. As a matter of fact, it was in the aftermath of the crash, an internal FAA memo surfaced questioning whether ValueJet should have been allowed to stay in the air. And the victims' families also pointed to statements made by ValueJet officials right after the crash that appeared to indicate the company knew the generators were on the plane and in fact had ordered them returned to Atlanta rather than properly disposed of in Miami. In other words, there was a lot of indicators that this crash could have been avoided. Now, on the 3rd anniversary of the accident in 1999, a memorial was dedicated to the victims in the Everglades. And you're going to see me going out there at night, okay? And you're going to see that the memorial consists of about 110 concrete pillars, and it's just north of Tamiami Trails, right off US 41. And like I stated while I'm filming, most of the contractors, the architects, the masons, the labor unions, they all built this for free. Okay. Now, as an you could tell when things are not going to surface. In June of 2013, okay, a local resident who was out there slogging around in the sawgrass, because I believe that they had open hunting for some of the pythons, that an invasive species that are out there in the Everglades. He found a partially melted gold pendant in that same exact area. And it's thought that this possibly could be either from the ValueJet crash or the crash of Eastern Flight 401, which I'm going to talk about later, which only occurred like less than 2 miles away from that same spot, which is very eerie, by the way. Now, the flight number 592, it was retired from ValueJet operations, and as a matter of fact, from AirTrans as well. And then AirTrans was integrated into Southwest Airlines at the end of 2014, and they retired that flight number as well. Another thing, it just so happens that when this accident occurred, that program Cops happened to be taping with Miami-Dade Police Department, and on season 9, episode 12, they aired some of the first 911 calls that had come into the 911 emergency operations as far as what had occurred. So I'm going to go ahead now and show you some clips of me out at the memorial at night, and you're going to see how desolate that is. I mean, you saw it now when I was driving out there, but when I'm there, there's nothing out there. And it's a powerful monument, but it's also very, very eerie. Especially as I go further in this video, you're going to see that, unfortunately, the crash of this flight was just one of many, many disturbing occurrences that have happened in this area of the Everglades. Okay, so I'm going to let you go ahead and see what happened with that when I was out there. So, as you could tell, it was really difficult to be out there. As a matter of, I think there's even times when you can hear the mosquitoes zooming around Henry, my poor videographer. He, as you could tell, he was not doing well. And if some of my facts were a little bit off, is I was too busy. You could see me going like this, and it was just really, really difficult. I wanted to stay out there. I wanted to film some more. I even wanted to quiet down, but it was impossible. It was impossible. Mosquitoes were just outrageous. It was intolerable. But anyway, and by the way, yes, in case somebody asks, that is me with a gun on my hip, because whenever I go out to do any of these investigations, especially in a remote area, I do carry my own personal weapon, which I have a permit for, because it's better to be safe than sorry. So whenever I go out to these locations, I'm well armed. But anyway, and now you're going to see me go into the second clip, which, by the way, I'm filming that one because my videographer, Henry, he hightailed it into the car and said, "You're on your own, baby." And, well, for love of my art. But anyway, here's a short little clip of what happened after, he said, I'm staying in the car. I'm telling you, I couldn't convince him otherwise. And now I really couldn't blame him. Life in the Everglades. So here, I already described and I told you a little bit about the ValueJet crash, which, like I said, was that was the most recent one that occurred in 1996. Now, I'm going to go into one that, believe it or not, a lot of people do not know about. This happened back in 1963, and I mentioned it briefly when I was out there. Back in 1963, there was another flight that crashed out there, and everybody on board died. There was less people because, of course, at that time, the planes, they didn't hold as many passengers. But there there was no survivors again. And I'm going to give you a backdrop to the story. And all of this, I want you to understand I'm building because you're going to see that there seems to be a trend of eerie incidents, curses. I mean, you'll see when I get later on into this video all the things that happened. That when you put all the pieces together, it's kind of says a lot of. It's very disturbing. And the Everglades are beautiful, mysterious, but very enigmatic and scary if you look at everything that's happened. And of course, these crashes, which were, a huge loss of life all at once. Well, even now, so many years later, it causes a lot of heartache still for a lot of people. And like I said, all these crashes occurred very close to one another. So let me go ahead and tell you a little bit about the 1963 crash. It was a Northwest Orient flight, and it went out of Miami International Airport on February 12th of 1963. It was a Northwest Airlines Boeing 720, designated as Flight 705, and it was scheduled to depart at about 1:30 p.m. bound for Portland and Portland, Oregon. Now, on the flight deck, they had Captain Almquist and First Officer Feller. Now, along with the flight engineer, they had 5 cabin attendants and 35 passengers. Which, by the way, their first leg of that journey was going to be to Chicago. They had a stopover in Chicago. Now, there was a squall line of bad weather that was just lying northwest of the city of Miami, and it was slowly moving southeast. Now, associated with this line of bad weather, there were storm cells up to 20 miles in diameter, and some reaching as high as 40,000 feet. Okay, and there had been a report put out basically saying that there was going to be moderate to severe turbulence with a chance of extreme turbulence inside the storms. In other words, this severe weather wouldn't be just as easy to fly around it. It was a wide swath of bad weather. Now, prior to leaving from Miami, the flight crew questioned the ground controller at the airport about the departure routes that were being used by other airplanes that had left prior. Of course, there was concern about this weather pattern. And the flight controller said that most flights were departing either through a southwest climb or a southeast climb and then back over the top of it. Okay. Now, when the jet lifted off the runway, the captain, basically what he did was he took a left turn based on the radar vectors from the Miami departure control. In other words, trying to avoid the areas that anticipated turbulence that were associated with the thunderstorm activity. Okay, and another flight had followed the same guidance shortly before the jet took off. In other words, other airplanes were taking the same route. Now, while maintaining 5,000 feet, the Flight 705 contacted the controllers, and they requested clearance to climb to a higher altitude. Now, there was a discussion between the flight controllers, between the flight and the radar departure controller about the storm activity. So obviously this crew was really worried about the weather, even after, once they were, they had departed and they were in the air. And they were given clearance to climb, and while they were getting that clearance from the Miami Air Route Traffic Control Center, they advised that they were in the clear and that they could see ahead, but that it looked pretty bad. Now, they were, like I said, they were given clearance to climb, and basically all efforts were being made for them to avoid this really bad patch of weather. Now at about 1:43 p.m., uh, they're still being they're being heard by the controller's tower. They were still in communication, and that again they were trying to find apparently some type of open area where they could avoid this weather as much as possible. And the controllers kept giving them clearance to go in these other directions and climb in order to avoid it. And in between all this discussion, they were talking about the severity of the turbulence, which they were describing as moderate to heavy. And as a matter of fact, the they were even telling the pilots were basically telling the controllers, you better steer everybody coming behind me off this route because the weather was that bad. Now, at about 1:45 p.m., the control of the Flight 705 was transferred to Miami Air Route Traffic Control Center. And they started encountering some communication difficulties, and they were told to go into a different frequency to tune in, and finally they established contact. Now, several minutes after the contact was established, the jet's altitude began to increase with a rate of climb gradually increasing to approximately 9,000 feet per minute. Now, this is a very rapid ascent, okay? And then the rate of climb decreased through zero when the altitudes peaked. Okay, they were at about 19,000 feet at that point. Now, in about the next 7 seconds, there was what they call negative acceleration. It continued to increase at a slower rate. Okay, now basically what was happening is the jet began to dive towards the ground with increasing speed, and as the descent continued, the acceleration was gaining. Now, below 10,000 feet, the forward fuselage broke up due to the force of the dive. And then the main failure in both wings, and basically, as the tail of the plane tore off and the whole plane came apart in the air. The forward fuselage broke upwards, and all four engines basically separated before the debris of the aircraft fell in the unpopulated areas of the Everglades. This was about 37 miles west-southwest of Miami International Airport. Now, this entire transmission took place about 13 minutes after takeoff, and this was the last thing that was heard from Flight 705. Now, shortly thereafter, several people that were in the Everglades heard a loud explosion followed by a ground tremor. And one woman said that she saw what looked like a ball of flame in the edge of a cloud. Now, the wreckage was strewn about 15 miles, in an area of 15 miles, indicating that there had been an in-flight breakup of the aircraft. While it was clear that the weather was severe in the area, originally they couldn't rule out sabotage, nor some other type of component failure. Because, believe it or not, this aircraft had already been involved in a landing accident a few months prior. Do you see your similarity to the Value Jet flight? Again, okay, there was no problem with weather with Value Jet, but again, this was an aircraft that already had accidents pretty recently before the accident. Now, remember, this is back in 1963, and it took a while to find this. First of all, to realize what had happened to the flight that had actually crashed, and to find it. Now, a team from the U.S. Fish and Game Commission reached the wreckage about midnight, and they radioed that they had found the plane burning. And the Coast Guard, they sent Coast Guard out there, and they spied the wreck near darkness, and basically they sent out helicopters to basically find a place where they could land, which in that area is marshy and boggy. And some of them described that all around us were little pieces of wreckage and a lot of luggage. But they did describe that it looked as if all the bodies were intact. But of course, this was they were just doing this by flashlight, so there was not much that they could see. Now, once the crash site was discovered, which was, this is in the Miccosukee, the Seminole area, that's held by these tribes. The Seminole Indian children were given a holiday, and basically about 50 miles west of Miami, in a place called Miccosukee. Back then, they had to set up a temporary morgue. Again, remember, just going out there to find it and retrieve any of the bodies or any of the debris, that in and of itself was incredibly difficult, especially in 1963. And the school where the Seminole children attended, this also became the CAB communications base. By the way, CAB is what later became the NTSB. And the wreckage was about 14 miles south of the operations base, across a swamp choked with thick undergrowth that only swamp buggies and weasel vehicles can penetrate. Now, the flight recorder was taken from the wreckage and flown by the Coast Guard to the operations base. Now, the following is a description given by a Miami News reporter by the name of Miller Davis. And this is what he described. The wreckage was still smoldering there in the sawgrass of the Everglades. The cabin of the once sleek airline had jutted like a black twisted gnome against the midnight sky. One engine lay in the weeds nearly a city block away, and beside us was a metal food hamper with its lid gaping open. We found a thong slipper flopped on its side. I believe I was alone for a moment when in the wet grass I saw a little plastic bag. It had one of those funny little pictures of a smiling Florida sun painted on its side. A toy soldier fell out, and then a sponge shaped like a baby monkey, and I didn't look anymore. 3 small fires still blazed around the wreckage and glinted off the shiny plastic bag. I suppose the rest of my life I will see that plaid zipper suitcase with its neatly pressed skirts and blouses seared by the fire and soiled with the wetness of the night dew. The pilot of our helicopter turned his heel and walked away. The pilot said, "Pray God it happened fast." Now the reporter then described, to see the scene in your mind's eye, pretend you're looking at a peaceful field of wheat, and then someone comes along and throws a junkyard of steel in its center, and then douses it with gasoline and lights a match. We trudged silently behind the cabman, and suddenly one of them pointed his finger to a dark blue lump. "That must be a stewardess's handbag," he said, "or is it?" Now, after the crash, 98% of the wreckage was airlifted by 9 Army helicopters to a field outside of Miami, where a mock-up held by chicken wire was reconstructed of the plane. There was debate as to the cause, why the 4 engines were found in different locations, and both wings had come off before the plane hit the ground. And they discovered that 15 of the passengers were free-fall victims, some of them still strapped to their chairs. The final report of the crash determined that the cause of the accident to be the unfavorable interaction of severe vertical air drafts and large longitudinal control displacements from which they couldn't recover. Now, as unfortunate as this incident was, when I read up on it, I found that they used the findings from this flight for instructions in how to handle this type of turbulence, because they found that there had been a lot of prior crashes based on the same scenario playing out and how these pilots were handling what they did with the planes when they encountered bad weather like this. So considering it was such a terrible incident, there was something positive that came out of it, because new determinations were made on how to handle this type of scenario. Now, I'm going to go into Eastern Flight 401. Now, Eastern Flight 401, it occurred in the 70s. And this was one that became very famous, not only because of the actual incident where, not everybody, not all passengers or crew lost their lives, but because of the ghosts that were witnessed by so many people, to the extent that there were books written and a movie was made. Okay, which I think, some people will say that it was all a lot of, it was made up. But while reading through and researching this, there was just too many people that worked on the airlines and passengers that witnessed this for this totally be made up, as far as having to do with a ghost or anything like that. But let me go ahead and give you the information on this very mysterious and very ghostly flight and what happened thereafter. And of course, this wrecked very, very close to where the Value Jet flight went down. As a matter of fact, they even used some of the same roads out there when they were doing the recovery. Now, it went down about 10 miles west of, again, Miami International Airport. As you could tell, this route was used by a lot of, well, it still is used by a lot of airplanes when they leave Miami International Airport. Okay, now, the Eastern Airlines Flight 501, it was a Lockheed L-1011, and it was a TriStar jet piloted by pilot Bob Loft, who was a veteran with over 30 years of flight experience, and his first officer was John Albert Stockstill, and the flight engineer, his name was Donald Lewis, or known as Don Repo, and there were 10 flight attendants. Now, on December 29th, 1972, Flight 401 was en route to Miami International Airport after departing from John F. Kennedy Airport in New York at about 9:20 p.m. On board, they had 163 passengers, and it appeared to be a problem-free and very routine flight. Okay, there was very little. None could suspect what was going to be coming or towards the end of that flight. At that time, it was described that the flight was upbeat. The passengers, the crew members were all looking forward to enjoying New Year's in Florida. Remember, this is December, January, where it was snowing in most of the United States, but in Florida, they had great weather. Now, this airplane was only 4 months old, okay? And it was the pride of the airline fleet. As a matter of fact, at that time, the TriStar was an aircraft which was considered one of the most modern and technologically advanced of its day. In other words, this, contrary to the other two airplanes, this was, for lack of a better word, it was a brand new airplane. Now again, the flight from JFK had been uneventful, and the crew was preparing to land. And this is when the first chain of events occurred, which would eventually lead to the loss of 101 lives. Now, the first officer, Stockstill, was instructed to lower the landing gear. Now, the crew became very alarmed when they noticed that not all the wheel indicator lights had turned green. And the captain, Bob Loft, he believed that it was just a faulty light bulb. In other words, he thought that the gear had gone down and the light bulb was just not turning on. Now, the concerned crew decided to cycle the landing gear several times, yet the green indicator light did not turn on. Now, they unable to get that desired communications or confirmation from that light for the landing gear. Loft, he decided not to land. He abandoned his approach, and he radioed into the flight tower, explained the situation, and the flight was put into a holding pattern over the Everglades until they could resolve the problem. Now, at this time, the plane was cruising in a pattern at about 2,000 feet in altitude, and the autopilot was engaged. In the meantime, this crew is dismantling the light, trying to figure out why it is not turning on. While all this is happening, the flight engineer, Don Repo, he invades the landing gear visually through a porthole to see that it is down, despite that they did not have the blinking light. While all of this is going on, and the crew is being distracted by the malfunctioning landing light gear, no one had noticed that the plane had gradually lost altitude due to the fact that someone had inadvertently disconnected the autopilot by leaning into the yoke that toggled it on and off. The distraction, plus the fact that there were no lights or visual frames of reference within the darkened wilderness below, prevented anyone from really grasping just how shockingly and dangerously low the plane had descended. As a matter of fact, I believe that at some point that they said that by the time Don Repo had that visual, and maybe he saw exactly where the plane was headed, it was too late. He realized that it was too late for the plane to be saved. Now, again, by the time the altitude discrepancy was noticed by the crew, it was too late, and Flight 401 plowed into the swampland at about a speed of 227 miles per hour, and the fuselage disintegrated as it crashed into the swamps. First Officer Stockser was killed on impact, and Robert Loft and flight engineer Don Repo initially survived the crash. Loft died while being pulled from the wreckage, and Repo succumbed to his injuries later at a hospital. In total, the flight crew and 97 of the 163 passengers were killed in this horrific crash, and 2 of the 10 flight attendants also died, making the incident the second deadliest single aircraft disaster in United States history. Now, the subsequent investigation into the crash cited pilot error as the main cause. The crew failed to monitor the altitude as they tried in vain to deal with the undercarriage problem. Now, again, tragically, it was later revealed that the nose wheel had indeed been locked in place, and it was the bulb that was faulty. Now, even though the majority of this airplane was destroyed, certain parts such as the galley were salvageable. Eastern and Lockheed agreed that these parts could be reused and fitted into other TriStars on the production line. In other words, they took all these parts, because remember, this was a brand new line of airplanes that were being produced. So they took these parts and they incorporated them as new ones were being built. Now, one such aircraft was the N318EA. And as the weeks and months passed, strange things started to occur. In JFK Airport in 1973, an Eastern Airlines TriStar was boarding on its flight down to Miami. Traveling that morning was one of the airline's vice presidents. Now, as a VIP passenger, he was allowed to go on the aircraft first, and he made his way over to first class. Of course, first class. Now, as he moved towards his seat, he noticed a company captain in full uniform, and he went over to have a chat with him. Now, during the ensuing conversation, he suddenly realizes that he's speaking to Bob Loft. Now remember, Bob Loft had just died, or he was aware that he had died in Flight 401 crash. The apparition quickly disappeared, and the vice president rushed off to find a crew member, terrified that it could be an omen, that something would happen to this aircraft. A search of the plane was carried out before any other passengers boarded, but there was no sign of the mystery captain. Now, a few months later, back at JFK, a crew member boarding the same aircraft was surprised to see Loft already on board. They apparently chatted to the ghost, not realizing who he was before he vanished right before their eyes. The flight was later canceled as the crew were too shaken to operate. In other words, they went up to who they thought was a captain in full uniform and started talking to him. I guess the part where he vanished gave him a clue. Now, on board the L-1011, uh, flight engineers would usually arrive at the aircraft before the other crew members so that they could do their pre-flight checks. Now, on a particular day, a flight engineer was stunned to see an Eastern second officer already sitting in his seat, and he immediately recognized him as Don Repo. Now, Don Repo, remember, it was the engineer on Flight 401, and the apparition said to him, "You don't need to worry about the pre-flight. I have already done it," before disappearing or right before his eyes. Okay. Now, some weeks later, another captain was checking the instruments before a flight from Miami to Atlanta. Staring him right in the face was the unmistakable outline of Repo's face. The captain claimed he distinctly heard the words, "There will never be another crash on an L-1011. We will not let it happen." During a flight from Atlanta to Miami on board the 318EA, the flight deck crew were enjoying their meals as they cruised at 39,000 feet. Suddenly, there was a loud knock coming from the hellhole. By now, the ghostly stories had been circulating around the company, and the crew were reluctant to look, but the knocking continued, and as the flight engineer opened the hatch, he was horrified to see the face of Don Repo staring back at him. Terrifyingly, this was where the engineer had been when Flight 401 had crashed. Remember, I had mentioned that there was a belief that Don Repo, when he went down there to get a visual about that landing gear, he actually did realize at that moment that they were going to crash. Now, it wasn't just the flight crews who saw the ghostly apparitions. On one occasion, several caterers who were loading the N318EA. Now, remember, this is the aircraft that had the salvage parts installed in it. They were loading it for its next flight, and they were seen rushing off the jet, and they refused to get back on. And when they were asked why, they all stated that they had seen a flight engineer who stood in the forward galley before vanishing right before their eyes. Passengers also reported strange occurrences. A woman sat next to an Eastern pilot who she said looked ill. She called a stewardess only for the pilot to disappear. Another lady summoned a crew member as she was concerned about the unresponsive pilot who sat next to her. The man once again disappeared, leaving the passenger hysterical. No wonder. Now, after these incidents, both women were shown pictures of the deceased Flora 1 flight crews, and they both identified Don Repo as a crew member they had seen. So far, the majority of the reports of spooky going on and ghostly sightings had been swiftly swept under the carpet by Eastern. As a matter of fact, while I was researching it, I found that if you employees of Eastern, you could lose your job if you were found to be talking about this or spreading stories about the ghostly going on. That's how serious they were taking these reports. I mean, and again, what airline is going to want their passengers thinking that their aircraft is haunted by a dead flight crew who perished on board the pride of their fleet? Although the airline had point blankly refused to believe the spooky stories, the sightings were all reported to the Independent Flight Safety Foundation, who later commented, "The reports were given by experienced and trustworthy pilots and crew. We consider them significant." Eastern went on to warn employees that they could face dismissal if they were caught spreading the ghost stories, as stated before. In other words, this was not just a couple of people talking about it. However, one incident changed everything. Flight 903 had just taken off from JFK en route to Mexico City, and stewardess Faye Merriweather, who was in the galley preparing meals for the passengers, reached for the handle of the oven door, and she was horrified to see the face of Don Repo staring back at her. Not one to panic, she briskly made her way to the front to get another stewardess and the aircraft's engineer to come with her to take a look. Sure enough, when they returned, Repo's face still stared out from the oven, although now it looked like he was trying to say something. Suddenly, all three clearly heard the apparition mutter the words, "Watch out for fire in this plane." Now, the flight reached Mexico City safely, but on the return leg, problems began with the aircraft's starboard engine. After an inspection, the aircraft was cleared for takeoff, but as the plane climbed away, the engine failed and backfired several times. It was quickly shut down before it caught fire, and they returned to the airport. Thankfully, no one was hurt during the incident, but the crew were understandably very shaken after what they had seen in the oven door. In other words, these apparitions of these pilots were just not crisis apparitions. They were actually giving warnings. As the sightings became more and more frequent, rumors circulated that the pilots and crew refused to fly on the L-1011s that had parts of the doomed jet fitted. Paranormal investigators requested numerous times to be allowed on board the aircraft to see if anything could be recorded, and of course the airline refused. However, all the salvaged parts from 401 were later removed from the suspect jets. The ghosts of Bob Loft and Don Rebo were never seen again, but their haunting words to protect Eastern's L-1011's fleet came true. In the years after the crash, until the airline's closure, there were no other fatal crash on board the TriStar fleet. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, it is nice to think that those dedicated pilots may have kept the rest of the TriStar fleet safe. Now, that particular aircraft, the N318E8, later went on to fly for Hong Kong carrier Cathay Pacific. Eastern Airlines eventually was liquidated in 1991 after years of labor disputes and a particularly debilitating strike in 1989, which I lived in Miami, and I remember seeing all those Eastern employees striking outside the Eastern headquarters because they were based here out of Miami off of Lejeune Road and Northwest 36th Street. So although the airline no longer exists, its legacy as America's haunted airline lives on. The curious flight of Flight 401 has become a staple in many discussions of modern hauntings. And it's been covered in the media from books to movies to TV shows. There was even a song. There's just something about the idea of a haunted airplane that seems to strike a particular chord with people. And the story of Flight 401 is found to be one of the most compelling hauntings out there due to the fact that many of the reports were made by sober, well-respected, experienced flight crews in high-level positions, such as high-ranking pilots, flight officers, and flight engineers. There seems to be little reason for them to lie or spread spooky stories, especially when their reputations and during Eastern's crackdown, even their jobs were on the line for doing so. In addition, sightings of the ghosts, who often appeared in full view of more than one person, were very clear and detailed and often made by multiple witnesses who were able to fully corroborate each other's story. If this is all just a case of people perpetuating an urban legend and creepy lore, then it is a fairly persuasive effort. And I'll tell you what, for all those people that actually came forward and said something, there was a bunch that never did. Either because of fear of repercussions from Eastern, or that they didn't want to be labeled, even amongst their peers. Because remember, not everybody witnessed this. It was just the people that were flying in these particular aircrafts. So I guarantee you, there was a lot of other Eastern employees who witnessed it, and I'm sure that there was other passengers who, one, for some reason, they just maybe wigged out quietly in their seat and didn't say anything, or they went and ordered 2 extra drinks and just stayed in their seats. So bottom line, I'm sure there's a lot of other witnesses that never came forward and said anything because this was the 1970s, and believe it or not, there was still a lot of people that had a hard time believing that this could be real. Okay? And as you could see that there was a movie made with it with Ernest Borgnine and a very young, well at that time, Kim Basinger. And I think it's really interesting to note that, this was a brand new airplane, and unfortunately, it was just a light bulb, and it was a bad series of incidents that led to that. There were survivors, and now we come to the last part. Now that I've covered those three, I'm going to go into all the other things that have happened in this area of the Everglades. Okay? I'm going to be doing separate shows about some particular incidents, but you're going to see that the Everglades is the place to dump bodies, just really unusual things. And it, contrary to what people think, it's not stuff that's recent. I bet you didn't know that the Everglades has got the legend of a pirate ship that is doomed to go around in that sea of grassland. Bet you didn't know about that, right? Okay. I want you now to go ahead and listen to all these mysteries and ghost stories that occur in this area of swamp and marshes, and it's beautiful. It is. It's a river, a sea. It's just beautiful. It's beautiful, but it's very mysterious, and I want you to listen to these tales because they're fascinating. Now, the like I said before, the Everglades, believe it or not, is sprawled out. It's more than just a swamp, which a lot of people think of it. First of all, it's what's called a natural tropical wetlands, and it's also called Pahokee. Okay, and it covers about 3 million acres of untamed land. Now, it's also home to numerous mysteries. They range from unsolved crimes, mysterious murders, lost cities, yes, lost cities, ghost ships, vanishings, and phenomena both natural and paranormal. Okay, and these vast wetlands have long been a place every bit as sinister and bizarre as they are beautiful and mysterious. Now, mysterious deaths and corpses seem to gravitate towards the Everglades, and this vast wetlands has seemingly become a veritable dumping ground for dead bodies, which have a way of popping up out of the weeds and muck to startle both locals and visitors alike. Now, the majority of these unsolved killings and mysterious bodies are in Collier County. And just to get an idea, Collier County lies west of Miami-Dade County. In other words, the Everglades starts on the western edge of Miami-Dade County on into Collier County, which is 2,025 square miles of mostly sparsely inhabited swamplands. And it is the largest county in the United States east of the Mississippi River. Now, in particular, the two main routes through this wilderness are US 41, which is what you saw me traveling through that night, and Alligator Alley, once known as State Road 84. Now, over the years, there's been a multitude of corpses discovered along these stretches. Now, most of these roads, both of these roads, they wind through uninhabited mosquito-infested swampland. Mosquito-infested, no kidding. Alongside prowling snakes, alligators, and perhaps insidious murderers as well. Now, one particularly grisly spate of murders occurred during the 1970s, during which the Everglades produced numerous corpses that baffled authorities and led them to suspect a serial killer was on the loose and was using this area as a dumping ground. The first unexplained killing occurred in February of 1971 when a Barbara Jean Washington was reported missing from her apartment along with her blue Chevrolet Vega. Despite sending out various bulletins across the state alerting other departments to the vanishing, no trace of the woman or her car would be found at the time. It was not until 18 months later that a team of surveyors working in the thick, stifling vegetation of the swamp around 2 miles from US 41 discovered a human skeleton, which was identified through dental records as that of the missing woman, who was determined to have died from a single gunshot wound to the head. An investigation would turn up no suspect in the killing and no sign of the woman's missing car. By the way, her death has never been solved. Nobody was held accountable for it. Other gruesome remains from unsolved killings would pile up in the ensuing years. In June of 1974, a group of hunters came across a putrid-smelling, rolled-up carpet lying out in the wilderness. Against their better judgment, they unrolled the carpet to find a badly decomposed corpse within it. And once again, the cause of death was determined to be a bullet hole in the skull, but this time a complete search of missing person databases and dental records turned up nothing. Not only is it unknown who the killer was, but even the identity of the victim, whose remains are still a complete mystery. Now, 6 months later, in December of 1974, two motorists from Dade County traveling along US 41 were startled when they came across something lying in the middle of the road, which forced them to stop their vehicle. There upon the remote road was a barely recognizable body of a badly charred human corpse. Authorities would find 2 bullet holes in the body's left side and speculated that the victim had been shot and then doused with gasoline and set on fire. The only part of the body which was not completely burned to a crisp was the victim's hands, which had been tucked under the body and had remained startlingly intact. Fingerprints taken from the hand which showed the victim was a man by the name of Willie James Revels of Miami, but the crime has never been solved. The following year, yet another unidentified body would be found with a bullet hole to the head. Apparently, shooting people in the head was the modus operandi of whoever was doing these killings. 1977 would bring with it numerous unsolved murders and discarded bodies, the first being that of Mark Schroeder, age 20, whose corpse was found on July 25th out in the rugged wilderness between Alligator Alley and US 41 by a group of Native Americans. He had been shot twice in the head. The very next day, on July 26, a skeleton wearing a gold chain was found enveloped in brush, yet it was never identified, and the cause of death is a mystery. On November 12th, yet another skeleton was found in the Everglades, this time a female. A month later, on December 11th, 1977, a woman's skeleton was found in a field of sawgrass located 40 miles east of Naples and about 75 yards off of Alligator Alley. In this case, the only clues remaining that had not dissolved away into the swamp were a t-shirt, white shoes, and a black pearl ring, and the identity of the woman has never been found. At the time, it was suspected that a serial killer may be at large, but there was no hard evidence to back up this or to even really link the crimes. Now remember, in some cases, some of these victims were found to still have jewelry, which kind of rules out the suspicion that this was for robbery. You know, they were left with their jewelry, which again is or probably was leading law enforcement to think that they might have some type of serial killer on their hands. I think what makes it also more difficult was that some of these victims couldn't even be identified to begin with. Now, the 1980s also brought with them mysterious murders. In June of 1982, the dismembered body of a young woman was found floating in a canal just off Alligator Alley. The woman's head, arms, breast, and legs had been completely cut away from the torso, and on her back the word drug, D-R-U-G, had been etched into the flesh with a knife. Her identity was never discovered. In March of 1984, 25-year-old Earl Blankenship was found dead floating in a bog by 2 fishermen off Alligator Alley. It was determined that the badly decomposed corpse had received multiple stab wounds, but the murder remains unsolved to this day. Now, this is only a small amount of the many bodies and unsolved murders that have been found in the Everglades. Right now, there's been approximately 175 unsolved homicides in this area since 1965. Now, the truly spooky aspect of this is that probably that's just the tip of the iceberg. Because let's face it, with the damp conditions, the scavengers that are in the area, the thick, impenetrable swamps and the sawgrass. Most of these corpses, or many of these corpses, are probably haven't been found. Now, it's been estimated by authorities that for every body found in the wilderness, there is there's probably another one out there that will never be discovered. I think that it's going to be more than that. Now, besides the difficulty of the terrain, solving these murders is made difficult by the fact that Collier County is known as having a particularly high traffic of transients with no particular ties to the community, who pass through to wander off to the next place, meaning that such killers are extremely hard to track down and most vanish just as surely as their victims. In many of these killings, there is no evidence, no suspects, and no chance of ever solving them. And indeed, it is even unclear whether these homicides are the result of mafia-style contract killings, drug wars, or serial killers. Now remember, most people find that most homicides, the most difficult to solve, are when it's a stranger on stranger. Okay? You have difficulty identifying the victim, which of course makes it difficult to identify the perpetrator. And of course, usually when it's stranger on stranger, you can't even find a motive, which is usually how sometimes you find out who committed the crime. Now, perhaps creepier than the number of mysterious murders and rotting human corpses littering the Everglades is the number of people who have simply vanished off the face of the earth in this area. Now, this area has long been known as having a habit of just swallowing people up without a trace, and just in the last decade, there have been several high-profile vanishings that have never been solved. In 1998, the news featured the mysterious disappearance of 14-year-old Wendy Hudacock, who went missing on November 15, 1998 in Naples, Florida. Now, at the time, her parents had been out of town on business and had left her and her sister in the care of a family friend. Now, the particular night that she disappeared, Wendy had told her sister, 16-year-old Charlene, that she was going to sneak out to a party. Although Charlene did not join her, Wendy made good on her plan and snuck out of the bedroom window, telling her sister to page her if she got found out. When the time got late and Charlene paged Wendy for 2 hours with no answer, and the last person to see Wendy was 20-year-old Ronald DiPeppo, who had picked her up in his car to drive her to the party and who had been with her when they left. Now, DiPeppo would claim that Wendy had received a page and then made a call at a payphone, after which she had requested to be dropped off at home to meet up with another person whose identity remains unknown. DiPeppo has never been actively sought as a suspect due to a lack of evidence that he had anything to do with it, and the fact that other witnesses have claimed to have seen the girl with other people at a time after he claimed to have dropped her off at her home. In fact, in the ensuing years, authorities have received numerous leads, tips, and sightings of Wendy from across the United States and even Canada, but they've led nowhere. And so the mystery of her disappearance remains unsolved. Now, in 1999, the body of 22-year-old Jeanette Ann Smith was found in a cardboard box near Alligator Alley. She was an exotic dancer from Pembroke Pines who had been strangled because she was suspected of being a snitch. And eventually, her killer was found. His name was Ariel Hernandez, and he's serving time in jail right now. And unfortunately, this girl was caught in the middle of a mafia conspiracy and hooked up also with a very violent individual who was the one that killed her. Now, in 2000, Kelly Hyde, a 22-year-old woman who had been reported missing, was found in the Florida Everglades. The identification of her body was made possible by a gold bracelet that her mother had given her. Usually when you see identification of this sort, that means that what was recovered was probably skeletal remains. Another rather infamous series of disappearances in the area are the cases of Terrence Williams and Felipe Santos. On October 1st, 2003, an illegal Mexican immigrant living in Immokalee, Florida, by the name of Felipe Santos was driving home from work with his two brothers in Naples when they were involved in a minor traffic accident, and Collier County Sheriff's Deputy Steve Calkins cited Santos for reckless driving and driving without a license at approximately 6:30 a.m. Although Santos was seen driving off in the patrol car with Calkins, it was later learned that he was never actually booked. Deputy Calkins would later claim that he had changed his mind on the way to the station due to Santos' good behavior and had dropped him off at a Circle K, never to be seen again. Calkins was never treated as a suspect. Eerily, on January 12, 2004, the same deputy, Steve Calkins, cited a 27-year-old Terrence Williams for an expired registration and for driving under the influence after attending a party. As with Santos' case, Calkins claimed to have had a change of heart and dropped the young man off at a Circle K, after which Williams seems to have stepped out of the patrol car and off the face of the earth. There must be something about the Circle Ks. Despite the suspicious similarities between the two cases, Calkins was again cleared of any wrongdoing. Even more recently was a 2009 disappearance of 7-year-old Ajir Desir. On January 10, 2009, Ajir's mother dropped him off at his grandmother's house in Immokalee, Florida, so that she could go to work. The boy went inside and then went outside to play with other children and was last seen around 5:15 p.m. Police extensively searched the area and found no trace of the boy, and at first it was suspected that he had been abducted by relatives and had been taken back to Haiti from where his family had immigrated, but in the end there was no evidence found to support that theory. No lead suspects or evidence have been brought forward to explain what happened to him, and till this day his disappearance remains a mystery. Now, the Collier County Sheriff's Office gets about 400 missing persons report a year, with 20 or 30 people declared missing at any given time. What happened to these people? Have they ended up dead like so many of the rotting corpses dragged from the swamp? The victims of violent crimes, were they abducted or runaways? No one knows. Now, in 2010, another body was found. This was the body of 40-year-old Marisol Ramon. She was found in the Everglades, and police arrested her boyfriend, Roque Torres, 60, who had escaped to Nicaragua. Apparently, she was his mistress, and he was, I guess, a very possessive man. Even though this was solved, again, this points to the Everglades as a place to dump a body. And in 2013, the body of missing Miami-Dade teenager Jesus Trejo, age 18, was also found in the Everglades after his family reported him missing. In May of 2016, that was less than a year ago, homicide detectives found a body being eaten by Everglades in the Everglades. And they were treating this as a homicide, by the way. October of 2016, 3 people were found shot dead in a vehicle parked on Miami Trail in Okeechobee. And this was found to be a murder-suicide, also tied into another fatal stabbing in Miami. And they found that vehicle on Miami Trail. The endless swamplands of Florida are the perfect places for murderers to hide bodies. Let's face it, after all, the bodies already smells like rotting flesh. And believe it or not, serial killers like Otis Elwood Toole, the Jacksonville cannibal, and Henry Lee Lucas both disposed of bodies here. As you know, they were known for having killed dozens, or I believe over hundreds of people. And even then, the total body count has never been totally satisfied. Now, believe it or not, individuals are not the only ones who have vanished within the Everglades, as there have been aircrafts that have gone missing here as well. One of the most famous such cases is that of Flight 19, a training flight of 5 Grumman Avenger aircrafts that left Fort Lauderdale Naval Air Base in 1945 on a routine run and vanished without a trace, giving them the nickname the Lost Patrol. If you think that the only place that planes go missing off of Miami is the Bermuda Triangle, Wrong. Now, no signs of the planes, nor so much as a scrap of wreckage was ever found for the patrol, and indeed the baffling disappearance would go on to spark intense speculation and become one of the cornerstones of the mystery of the Bermuda Triangle. A promising discovery was made in 1989 when a Broward Sheriff's pilot on a routine drug interdiction flight spotted the rusted out hulk of a World War II airplane in the thick wilderness of the Everglades below, about a mile north of Alligator Alley, which had been partially revealed by a brush fire. A subsequent search expedition to the wreckage turned up no human remains and no tail or registration numbers, making it difficult to determine if it had indeed been one of the planes from the lost patrol. Oddly, the Federal Aviation Administration and the National Transportation Safety Board reported that there was no record of an aircraft crash in that area. Okay, so if it was not the lost patrol, who or who was this aircraft, or what was this aircraft? When was it that it occurred? Now, the Everglades has swallowed up an unknown number of aircraft, never to be seen again, ranging from drug planes, private aircrafts, military planes, during exercises, and while some of the wreckage of these crashes occasionally found, some are no doubt doomed to remain out in the thick weeds and the muck forever with their secrets, reasons for crashing, in some cases indeed their very existence, to be eternally denied. Remember, this the same thing, just so you can get an idea of how well that the Everglades can hide things. If you think that it only hides bodies, it can do the same thing with large pieces of machinery as big as a plane. In addition to mysterious murders and vanishings, other mysteries can be found in the Everglades as well. About 8 miles south of Alligator Alley is a 3-acre site which no roads lead to, is not on any map, and is called a Lost City, or more ominously, Ghost City. Once a Seminole village, it was suddenly abandoned for unknown reasons and went on to spawn a variety of folklore and legends. Lost City sits within an overground tangle of dense forest, and here among rotting makeshift shacks and ancient ruins are discarded native artifacts, some of which are between 1,000 to 2,000 years old. A canoe, a kettle, and oddly equipment used for distilling alcohol, aka moonshine, yet its true purpose has never been ascertained. What is known is that the site had its fair share of lore. One story is that during the Civil War, a group of 30 to 40 Confederate soldiers hid out here with a stash of gold they'd stolen from the Union, only to be mercilessly slaughtered by Seminole warriors materializing from the dark forest to protect their sacred land. One of the most popular tales of the Lost City is that the legendary gangster Al Capone used the site as a secret, isolated bootlegging operation to make moonshine, which he then shipped illegally to a local saloon and dance hall he owned. The wreckage of old war planes have been found in the vicinity, as well as adding to the mystique of missing planes going down over the Everglades. Some of the Everglades mysteries are more ghostly in nature, and the wetlands here have been long said to be the haunt of a ghost pirate ship cruising the rivers, the Caribbean Sea, Gulf of Mexico, and Florida's coast. Bays and rivers were once a favorite stomping ground for numerous pirate vessels. Now, remember, this predates a lot of the, how can I say, when actually people were living here in this area of the Everglades on the west coast off the Gulf. But at that time, believe it or not, this was a good place if you were a pirate if you wanted to hide out. And that's why it became a favorite place, because they started out raiding the Spanish treasure and merchant ships in the 16th and 17th century, and by the 18th and early 19th century, they had branched out into attacking slave ships, fishermen, and just about anyone who was unfortunate enough to come across them out in the water. Now, this is how the legend of the ghost ship of the Everglades started. Okay? And basically, this is a ghost ship that was doomed in a sea of grass. And it was told by sailors during the 19th century. It centers around a crew of phantom pirates, much like the crew of the infamous Flying Dutchman, and the cutthroats were cursed to sail the grasslands and twisted channels of the Everglades as part of an eternal punishment for their sins. No one really knows the age of the story, but it is very old. Told in various ports of the Gulf and East Coast, it was said to have already been more than 300 years old by the time it was published in newspapers across the country in 1901. It's a moral tale, and it originated in the days of the real pirates of the Caribbean Sea and the Gulf of Mexico. And the story likely had its roots in days when crews of pirates lurked in the bays and rivers of the Florida coast to wait and watch for prey. Now, these ships sailed for centuries under the names of captains like William Augustus Bowles, known as Billy Bowlegs, Jose Gaspar Gasparilla, Jean Lafitte, and others, and in the 16th and 17th century they raided Spanish treasures and merchant ships. Now, these pirate raiders attacked the Spanish ports of St. Augustine and San Marcos de Palache, known as St. Mark's. Now, by the 18th and early 19th century, their targets evolved to slave, merchant, and even fishing vessels. And in other words, even though they were still pirates, smuggling and filibustering became a new way of life for the marauders. Now, the story of the ghost ship of the Everglades began with a chase on the high seas near the Florida Keys. Spotting a merchant vessel in the distance, the crew of a pirate ship gave chase, and the captain and sailors of the merchant ship, however, were not easy prey. Experienced at their trade, they led the pirates on a long chase that continued for hours. Both ships were near Cape Florida when the pirates finally managed to close on their prey and force the merchantman to surrender. Furious at the length of the chase and the brave resistance of the gallant crew, the gallant crew of the merchantman, the pirate captain cruelly forced every one of the crew to walk the plank. And he kept the skippers, and he made the skipper's wife watch their fate, including that of her husband. Now, when the last of the crew had been put to death, the captain, his wife, who was terrified, found herself filled. I guess she knew she was going to get killed. And she fell to her knees. This is what the story says. She fell to her knees and she called upon God to judge and punish her captors for their deeds. Now, at this moment, a curling line of foam came sweeping down over the calm expanse and lifted both vessels in its embrace, carrying them away. The ships were carried inland atop a giant tidal wave. The fate of the merchant vessel was not recalled by the tale, but the voyage of the pirate ship was far from over. On and on the tidal wave bore the pirate ship on its snowy crest. Across the sandy shallows, high over the beach above the tallest trees for miles, the great wave carried the pirate until it finally settled down the center of the great, pitiless solitude. The wave finally expended its strength and faded back to the sea from which it had come. The pirates, however, were left behind, stranded deep in the twisting channels and grasslands of the Florida Everglades. According to the story, they remain there to this day. Unable to find their way out of the labyrinth of water and grass, they died one by one from fever and starvation. Their suffering, however, was far from over. Even after death, the pirates were left to sail the Everglades as ghosts, searching forever for a way out of their prison of grass. Now, the Indians and hunters in the Everglades tell of seeing this pirate ship with rotting masts and hull and with sails, trying to find a channel out of the sawgrass pools into the deep blue waters of the sea. The legend reminds us not only of the days when pirate ships sailed the Florida waters, but of a time when the Everglades were all but unknown to the American public at large. Now, strange paranormal activity is so heavily associated with the site of the airplane crashes of Eastern Flight 401 and ValueJet 592, which were only 300 yards apart. Now, I've heard reports, and other sources have reported disembodied moanings. This is in the area, the site of the airplane crashes of 401 and 592. Disembodied moaning, crying, screams are said to be heard, and there's inexplicable drops in body and temperature. These are all very common. There's also been sightings of orbs and also shadow figures skulking in the darkness. And the location is still said to basically give off a feeling of panic or dread. Hard to believe. Now, the Florida Everglades are undoubtedly an impressive sight, a place full of fascinating wildlife, natural wonders, and an eerie beauty. However, there's also an undeniable sense of creeping fear when looking into this dense wilderness, and I know firsthand because I've been there several times, which becomes all the more evident and urgent when one looks at the long history of death and strangeness that this wetland is permeated with. From mysterious murders to vanishing ghosts, bizarre beasts to horrifying wildlife, historical oddities, the Everglades is every bit as steeped in mysteries as its natural grandeur. Perhaps someday we will solve its enigmas. But it certainly seems that others are fated to remain out there cloaked in the swamps, marshes, sawgrass, and muck, hovering beyond our understanding. And I promise in future shows I'm going to be going in depth into some of the mysteries, murders, and paranormal events that occurred out there. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this video with me. Again, I hope you like it. I hope you subscribe to my channel. I would love to get your feedback. I loved bringing this to you. I think it's super interesting. And, again, if you have suggestions of other topics that you would like for me to present, I'd be more than happy to do everything I can to do so. And it's incredible sometimes the mysteries that you have on your own back door, which is the case for me with the Everglades. So again, and if you have, by the way, if you have any stories that you know of, whether they're true or just urban myth associated with any of this area, please, if you could send that to me, I would love to hear about them. I really, truly do. Because as much as things are sometimes written about or explored, there's always somebody out there that has heard, either firsthand or from somebody else, about some other experience, some other story. Believe me, this area is huge. And I'm sure there's a lot of stories out there waiting to be told. So again, thank you for spending this time with me. And I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed bringing it to you. And this is a Sunday for me. So please have a great rest of the week and take care.